Thank you, everyone. I am just, I feel so enriched from being in the company of everyone and the opportunity to learn for so many wonderful presentations yesterday and today. So I had a lot of qualifying statements at the beginning that I feel are not as necessary now because there's so much work from the presentations to build on. But when I was planning this conversation, one of the pieces that I wanted to think about was the way in Montessori communities that public Montessori, because it's free tuition, is often assumed to be serving a really diverse audience of students or students from low SES backgrounds, and is assumed to be equitable. And I wanted to share some of the things that I found in the course of my research and in other folks' research as well that operate as important points of diagnosis to show where the work needs to move forward. And I really appreciate Allison's framework from earlier today, thinking about what are the positive things that are happening and also where does the work need to progress in the future. So the questions I'm going to be talking about today are some of the things that I found in my research about who attends public Montessori schools. And I'm also beginning with a baseline, assuming that we have a general appreciation for all the things that are wonderful about Montessori. I'm going to focus in this conversation about the challenges. So what are the challenges to equity through accessing Montessori in the public context? And then what are the challenges to equity after enrollment in public Montessori? And in thinking about defining equity, we had some beautiful definitions earlier in the conference of equity being about everyone having what they need educationally. So rather than equal provisions for everybody, having customized provisions. And as somebody I interviewed for a research project on school integration in New York City this summer said, equality is about everybody having the same shoes, and equity is about everyone having shoes that fit them. And so I asked my daughter to make a visual of that because I like the metaphor so much. And so that's the image that she came up with. So just some context on public Montessori schools. The Montessori Census, which is part of efforts of the National Center for Montessori in the public sector, currently reports 559 public Montessori programs, which constitutes about a quarter of the total Montessori schools in the US. About half are charter schools, half are magnet, and almost all are selective schools. Very few are neighborhood schools that students are automatically enrolled in. This means that public Montessori in the US is the largest public system in the world, although there are public Montessori programs in India, in the Netherlands, in Vietnam, in the United Kingdom. And you see as you look at this map, Montessori existing in urban, rural, and suburban communities. And there are clusters in cities and in states with strong leadership and activism from parents and educators. So like especially Puerto Rico has that cluster of 81 that come out of Ana Maria Garcia Parro's work there. Clusters that come out of desegregation court orders, which created magnet schools, and also strong representation in states that are friendly to charter schools that have relatively weak charter legislation, including Arizona, Florida, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And public Montessori follow the same Montessori practices as private schools, but they also need to follow public school requirements of having a publicly certified teacher, testing requirements. And it's this constant tension of feeling trapped in between, not being Montessori enough for private Montessori educators, not being public enough for public educators. I've written in a research study with colleagues at Vanderbilt University about some of the real promises of public Montessori and the things when I interviewed Black and Latinx parents of Montessori students in Hartford. the things that they especially appreciated about Montessori were about the cultivation of independence and self-control among their children, the fact that their children were treated with respect, and that there was less punitive discipline. And also the power of mixed age classrooms for children to experience being leaders and not being stigmatized for where they were academically, that they could be academically ahead, they could be behind, but they didn't have a sense of that hurting them in their learning. One of the things that I found when I started doing research on public Montessori back in 2013 was that we had very little data on the racial demographics of students attending public Montessori schools. And so I was working for a while supporting the National Center for Montessori in the public sector on their data gathering efforts for the census. And then I used that data set to then come up, connect to the National Center for Education Statistics data and use that data to find out the racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds of students in public Montessori schools. There's a big caveat with that, which is that I was only able to use the data from roughly 300 of these 569 schools. And that's because the remaining schools have partial Montessori programs. And so I couldn't count the number of students in the partial programs because it isn't reported out as something separate. So I had to do an analysis based on the smaller numbers. But one of the things that I found from that sample is that over half of the students enrolled in public Montessori are students of color, 54%, with 28% Black students, 19% Latinx students. Although the percentage of Black students in public Montessori has been going down in the last decade, while the number of white students has been going up. So important trends to be looking at that. And this paper in the Journal of Montessori Research has a lot more trends about that. I was also really interested in thinking about school segregation and Montessori. One really exciting finding was that students of color in public Montessori are less likely to be in segregated schools in comparison to students of color in traditional schools. And public Montessori schools on the whole are more racially diverse than public schools overall. Although this is split, magnet schools are more likely to have racial diversity than charter schools, which makes sense because magnet schools were created to create racial diversity, whereas that hasn't been something important for charter schools. Another thing that I found in my research as I interviewed leaders at different schools was the challenge of maintaining racial diversity in public Montessori, that often the schools could be so desirable that even if they started with a mission of being very racially diverse, that diversity would be hard to maintain. So in today's presentation, I'm going to talk about several of the challenges, first of accessing public Montessori schools, and then some pieces of challenges that happen inside the schools. And I may skip through some of the things based on topics that have already been covered in some of the previous presentations. So it's really important to talk about the way that public Montessori fits in a broader context of school and district choice policies. And we were getting into that a little bit yesterday with some of the challenges that the researchers doing randomized control trials using Montessori school lotteries were coming across, was that there were a lot of inequitable admissions policies in public Montessori schools. What we know from school choice research, let me just shift here, is that the random lottery, even though it treats everybody on the same, everybody has a number that they put in the system, but there are people who are more likely to participate in those lotteries. And so one of the challenges that can happen in a random lottery is that you may have what my colleague Molly Macris calls too many white ping pong balls in the lottery. in that families who have socioeconomic resources or who may be white are more likely to participate in school choice lotteries than families of color. So the most equitable kind of school choice policy is actually having a weighted lottery that gives preference to people who are less likely to participate in school enrollment processes. And we are not able to select people based on racial categories anymore, but you can use proxy measures like socioeconomic status, special ed, ELL students, or students who are homeless as a way of excuse me, of increasing the diversity of students in schools. Less equitable policies, which a number of Montessori schools that I studied still use, in some cases, first come, first serve. So in my previous slide, let me just go back. My book project opens with this incredible moment in 2014 where parents in Ohio were camping out to enroll their children in Dater Montessori in Cincinnati. And a snowstorm hit. And so they were camping for several days in the snow in order to be in line to enroll their children in Montessori schools. So on the one hand, that shows tremendous dedication and devotion on the part of these parents. But the people who are able to have the job flexibility or the time to wait it out, and maybe heat insulated sleeping bags, are more likely to succeed in that endeavor than people who are not able to wait in line. Another way that public Montessori schools will screen out families is that they will offer a private preschool program that is tuition paying. And then you get a spot in the public Montessori starting in kindergarten. Other Montessori schools that I came across in my research offered only a partial day program. They did not offer busing, and they did not offer free lunch at their schools. So all of those are things that make it really difficult for families who need those services to access public Montessori. Marketing is another way that families are either brought closer or are pushed away from Montessori. And one of the most common themes that I see as I look at different Montessori schools is a downplaying of the academic benefits of Montessori and a focus on kind of the whole child and outdoors learning of Montessori, which again can serve to be really appealing to some families and really dissuade other families, especially if you're coming from a background where you haven't heard of Montessori, you're a little skeptical of this, and you really need assurance that this is going to be a method that is going to be academically successful for your children. Island Village Montessori Charter, every time I check their website, I'm struck by the whiteness of the children on their advertising. So these kinds of images and messages make powerful statements about who is included and who is welcome in these schools. Montessori also has connections to gentrification, both that the schools will sometimes gentrify because of the demand of families wanting to access them, and actually that Montessori schools can cause further gentrification in the neighborhoods around them. This is a photograph that I took when I was visiting City Garden Montessori School in St. Louis of some of the teardowns that were happening and new constructions being built around the school. And the school subsequently organized both to work towards affordable housing in the neighborhood and also created a set-aside admissions policy to give preference to certain populations of students to maintain the diversity in their schools. In another instance, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a year after their school had opened, one of the teachers called me for some advice based on my research, and she said that property values had almost doubled in the schools, in the houses immediately around the school. So that's an important facet to be thinking about in terms of the impact of public Montessori on the surrounding community. And partly because of gentrification and because of displacement, Montessori has been repeatedly publicly contested by families of color. And so in the course of doing my research, I found evidence of public protests against bringing Montessori in a number of cities around the country, including this instance in Charleston, South Carolina. And this was a protest objecting to making Hersey Montessori a complete school-wide Montessori program and getting rid of a traditional program as well for students. So I've talked about some of the issues having to do with the access into public Montessori and ways that regular choice processes that are run by the district and also specific choice processes having to do with Montessori can have impacts. Oh, I think I also forgot to mention another piece with Montessori admissions policies. I came across a number of instances where Montessori schools would not admit students in upper grades. And so that, because they didn't believe that they would adapt well to a Montessori environment. And that is very different from the policies of traditional public schools that need to be open and accessible to students at any point when they turn up. So in the second part, I want to talk about some of the equity challenges inside the school. And I think we've had a lot of really good conversation about that already today. In terms of the student outcome data, this is definitely the $64,000 question in terms of broader policy advancement of more public Montessori. But our conversations so far in this conference have talked about why it is so hard to collect this data, particularly in a pandemic, but also having to do with some of the challenges to data collection, including the demand differences between predominantly Black Montessori schools and predominantly white Montessori schools, and differences in terms of the willingness of families of color to participate in these ongoing research studies. So I think this is a space where we need more data, but it's also really hard to collect this data. We have also talked about the need for Montessori teachers to be representative of the communities that we teach. We know overall in the US that public school educators are roughly, I think it's 82% white, and whereas the public school population is over 50% students of color. So there's a real mismatch there, and that's connected to a long history of displacement of Black educators in particular from public schools since the Civil Rights Movement. And I just included this image. If you do a Google search for Montessori teacher, these are some of the images that come up. I think I did a search the other day, and there are a couple more teachers of color featured now, but it's still a fairly white representation. As of when I last checked, AMI, AMS, and MACD, none of them were collecting racial and ethnicity data on their membership. There are, so I think this is an area where we absolutely need information. The National Center for Montessori in the Public Sector has done some initial surveying, but we really don't know this information. Other folks have talked about anti-bias and anti-racist pedagogy, and there's the beginnings of ABAR training from AMS. Montessori for Social Justice has been doing this for a number of years at their conferences with a day-long training. And folks have talked about the importance of this not being a one-off training, but an ongoing training. I shared with all of you yesterday some really interesting initial research from Lucy Canzanieri Golden and Juliet King, who went to 3 different public Montessori schools that had embraced doing culturally responsive and anti-bias, anti-racist pedagogy. And they were trying to understand, can we see any kind of impact? How are they implementing it? And they found, even schools that had spent several years doing doing this practice were really doing it at different levels of implementation with different understandings of what it looked like. And it wasn't clear that they were starting to see outcomes yet. So I think it speaks to the ongoing nature of this work and the fact that nothing is a silver bullet. It's important to begin and sustain this work for a long period of time. And the other thing that I would mention as well that impacts the experience of equity has to do with the role and power of parent communities in Montessori spaces. As I've shown in my research, parents have been really critical to advancing the Montessori movement, are often the folks who mobilize together to start public Montessori schools. I've been part of that in New Haven with Elm City Montessori School. So there's a lot that parents can offer, but there are also ways that parents can present real challenges to equity. And many of you have listened this fall to the really excellent podcast, Nice White Parents. Chapter 6 in my book is basically like Nice White Parents Montessori edition, showing the way that parent organizing and the parent leadership at these two racially diverse magnet schools in Hartford increasingly centered the interests and needs of white parents and really silenced the questions and priorities of parents of color. So there's a lot of work that can be done to be really attentive to who has voice in the parent community at the school, whose interests are being centered, what priorities are being pushed, and how can that be changed to be more reflective of the population of students at the school. So I think one of the themes I want to speak about overall is the power of research as a diagnostic tool that can push and improve practice. And I tried, one of the things that motivated me so much in writing the book and getting it out quickly was my sense that it could be something that would be useful for practitioners as well as researchers. And I try as much as possible to share and interact with educators in training. And it's been great to participate in reading groups of educators and parents who are reading my book together and talking about that in the context of their schools. I put together, just to end, a research question wish list. I think a number of them link to things that others have talked about, especially Allison's wonderful list of questions. I think it's really critical, first and foremost, to be engaging and supporting researchers of color in furthering this work. I think also thinking about how we make information about accessing graduate school accessible. I have an initial document that I've shared with Angela that has kind of guidelines about, if you're interested in pursuing a PhD, here's some advice that I've learned from my own journey through this process. But I'm happy to share that with anybody who's interested, and as well as support folks who are interested in pursuing PhDs. There are huge questions we don't know about in terms of the demographic makeup of public Montessori teachers. I would love somebody to crack that nut and also get the national organizations to start regularly collecting this data. So AERA, that's one immediate thing you can do, AMIRA, as well for AMI and AMS. What kinds of trainings exist around race, equity, and accessibility, and then also how effective they are. How well are public Montessori schools supporting the needs of children and families of color and special education eligible students? How effectively are public Montessori schools addressing racism and bias? And also this question of the publicness of public Montessori. So what impact do public Montessori schools have on the choice ecosystem around them? Are they collaborative with the broader public sector, or are they operating in ways that are extractive to the broader public sector? So thank you again for listening, especially at the end of 2 long days, and I really look forward to talking with you more.